welcome you to today's Wednesday webinar from EPIP. This is Biz Gormley from EPIP. I'm the Membership and Operations Manager here, and we are so excited to have so many of you on the line. I'm just going to go through some quick housekeeping and an introduction to today's webinar and a little overview of who we are here at EPIP. And then I'm going to pass the mic over to our awesome presenters who will lead us through today's conversation about managing discomfort, tough conversations about identity to strengthen your work. So we're, excuse me for my webcamming. We are excited to have a lot of folks on the webinar today who are longtime members, but also many of you who are new to EPIP. So just a few minutes to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do here as a community and as a group in the world. EPIP is the Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy, and we are a national network of foundation professionals, social entrepreneurs, and other change makers who strive for excellence in the practice of philanthropy. And we do that really three ways. We provide a platform for our community to connect with others, to learn and practice leadership skills, and to inspire emerging ideas in the social sector. These are obviously high-level practices, and it really takes shape in a lot of different ways in our national programs, in our annual conference, and in our local chapter work. We'd love to talk to you more if you have questions about membership or if you have questions about connecting with your local chapter or folks in the community, the EPIP community near you. So please feel free to reach out. My email is biz@epip.org, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. No question is too small, so I look forward to hearing from you. I also just wanted to plant a seed for some upcoming events. In a couple weeks, we actually are going to be taking a session off from webinars because a bunch of our community are going to be at the People of Color Network delegation with the Policy Link Equity Conference in LA. So we'll be excited to share back lessons from that and experiences from that on our blog. So please sign up for the newsletter to be able to follow those stories. But we do have another webinar coming up on November 4. It's actually at a special time at 3:15 p.m. so that we could make sure all of our speakers could get on the line. It's 3:15 p.m. on November 4th, and we're going to be talking about movement building and divesting in fossil fuels with Jenna Nicholas from the Phoenix Global Impact and Chris Rurik from the Russell Family Foundation. So you can sign up for those events online at our website and check out any of the local chapter events and other upcoming things at epip.org/events. Just a couple notes on housekeeping for today's webinar. We do have some interactivity planned, so we're excited to have some polls embedded in the conversation, as well as some opportunities for discussion. If you're on the phone, unfortunately, you won't be able to raise your hand, but if you're on a computer, please feel free to use the hand-raising feature, which looks like a little hand in your control panel, and we can hopefully call on you to share some of your ideas and perspectives. If you have any technical problems or sound or issues with the slides or anything like that, please just let us know in the question section of the panel. And at the end, we're going to loop back into a more robust question and answer, so you can also use that question panel there to save questions that you'd like us to loop back to at the end. If you're following us on social media, we'd love you to please share your thoughts, live tweet, whatever way you'd like to share your experience in today's webinar online. The hashtag is EPIP webinar, so hashtag EPIP webinar. And just so you know, we are recording the webinar so that folks, including you, can access it after today's experience. When you're done, you'll get an email with you'll get a prompt to fill out a survey, and we'd love to hear your feedback just so we can make sure that we're continuing to provide content that really matches your needs and giving you a chance to ask any lingering questions that you have. So without further ado, we're going to move into the thick of things. Again, today's topic is managing discomfort, tough conversations about identity to strengthen your work. And we are really grateful to our speakers. Thank you so much to all of you for putting all the work into bringing together this presentation. We have Nicola Chin from Up With Community, Janae Isler from the NCRP National Community for Responsive Philanthropy, and Althea Gonzalez from Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees and a private consultant. I'm going to pass the mic over to you guys.
Thank you so much, Biz. And we're also really excited to be here. I'm Janae Isler, as she said, from the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, and I'll be the moderator for our webinar today. Most of the knowledge and the content is going to come from Althea and from Nicola. And you may not see Nicola's name there yet, but she is going to be joining us here momentarily. We wanted to take a little bit of time to share a bit more about who we are before we jumped into the webinar. So I'll go first, and then hopefully Nicola will be on, and then we'll hear from Althea. As Biz mentioned, I'm at NCRP, and most of my background has been in the nonprofit sector, and I've done a lot of work around organizing and also community building and leadership development around identity, and especially how identity creates conflict in our societies. So I've worked for a wide variety of types of nonprofit organizations, and now working at NCRP as the field director, I try to help our nonprofit members connect more strongly with philanthropy who's interested in NCRP's goals and visions around supporting more social justice organizations and promoting transparency and accountability in the sector. So that's who I am. I don't see Nicola's name yet, so why don't we go to Althea and let Althea introduce herself, and then we'll come back to Nicola.
Thanks.
So there you go. Thanks.
Excellent. And so in addition to being a project manager at Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees, I'm also a consultant supporting nonprofits and philanthropic institutions, predominantly in North Carolina. And my work over the last many years has been in the nonprofit sector at a variety of levels, including having worked with Hispanics in Philanthropy managing work in North Carolina. And all of my work has really been focused on how immigrant communities, Latino communities, are receiving funding at a disparate proportion to other communities in our country, and how to even the playing field. So identity is a huge piece of how I've been doing my work recently. And I see that Nicola has joined us, so awesome to have her. Maybe we can go back to her slide so she can introduce herself as well. Liz, can you take us back one slide?
Yes, I can take us back one slide.
There we go.
1 second for Nicola. Nicola,
can you
hear
all
us?
hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
we can.
Wonderful. My apologies. I got the time confused, and I apologize for being late.
It's all right. We're just starting with introductions, so if you want to say a little bit about yourself and share with the group who you are, that would be great.
Hi everyone. I'm really pleased to be here with you today. I've been looking forward to this for several weeks. Just looking forward to it an hour later. I come to this work as a community organizer, working on immigration reform, youth organizing, and youth development. And I have predominantly been on the fundraising side of things. So in my current role, helping organizations think through how to insert their values into their day-to-day practices, I have been working with several foundations and have gotten a chance to work with several funders and staff in philanthropy to think critically about how do we match our values in our giving and in how we treat each other internally within our organization. So that's how I come to you today.
Great, thank you. So as we've all mentioned, we're really excited to be here, and to get us started in our conversation, we have a little poll for you. So as you know, we'll be talking about identity and how it impacts the workplace, but also in other areas of our lives. And we'd like to hear from all of you who are watching and who are listening on the phone. Firstly, which aspect of your identity is most significant in your work and workplace relationships? And even though we're all complex human beings, we only are going to let you choose one. So go ahead, we'll give it 30 to 60 seconds for folks to vote. So Biz, I can't see how many folks have voted. Oh, here we are. So there's a bit of a tie between age and race and ethnicity. Next, we have gender, and then we have other. And unfortunately, the poll would only let us do 5 options. So I'm curious if folks who chose other might want to chat to me or to Biz what some of the other aspects of identity are for you. And while we're receiving those chats, I'm going to go on to the next poll question. Which is, which aspect of your identity is most significant in your life outside of your workplace? Alrighty. Interesting. So outside of the workplace, it looks like gender is the most significant aspect of identity. Then we have ethnicity and race, then age, then sexual orientation. For the first question, inside the workplace, most folks chose class or something related to class in the other category. Education also came up in the other category. So we wanted to start with this little poll because, unfortunately, even though we are complex, we do often get asked to cut ourselves up into little pieces or put ourselves in boxes. And despite the beautiful human beings that we are, one aspect of our identity can influence how others engage with us. So we wanted to show that and get your experiences in a poll fashion, and also think about how we may have to show up differently at work according to others' expectations than we do outside of work. Next slide, please. We also wanted to start with a little discussion before we got into some definitions and skills. So we have an opportunity here for you to use the hand-raising feature that Biz talked about. You can raise your hand if you want to speak verbally. You can also communicate with us via chat, and it'll be just a short 5-minute discussion. But we wanted to consider these 2 questions. Why are you personally interested in helping your organization explore practices of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And how will doing this increase the impact of your organization and its work?
Right, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute hand raise from Vashti.
Great.
Go ahead, Vashti.
So sorry, I don't have anything to say. I accidentally raised my hand when I was opening the poll, but I promise to have something to say later.
Okay, well, we know the feature works now, so other folks, if you want to raise your hand, we'd love to hear your thoughts. All right, great. I'm going to put Ariane Schaefer
on. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
I've never used the hand-raising feature. I love this question. So I work at Kindle Project, and we have a program called the Indie Philanthropy Initiative, which is basically working to change the conversation in philanthropy to get more outside-the-box funding practices going. And this question is always on my mind and on our minds, you know. So when doing donor education, I mean, of course, we look at it in our own organization as well, but when we're trying to educate donors, oh, I lost the question. Oh, there it is. This is a question that needs to be asked over and over and over again to me, internally, as an individual, as an organization, and as the field of philanthropy. And then you can look at like creative grant making practices. So that's something that's on my mind all the time. And my curiosity is in how to phrase that in an approachable way when doing donor education. So I answered your question a bit more with a question, so I apologize for that, but I don't want to take up too much space here. But yeah, thank you for asking it.
Great. Yep, and we're definitely going to get into some ways to have this conversation creatively. Yep.
Great.
It looks like maybe we could go to the next question.
Yep. So if we have one more person online who wants to respond to either of these two questions, I think we can take that before we move on.
It looks like we also have one person who wasn't able to use the hand raise, but talked about how this conversation can help move the needle for the field across practices and philanthropy. So just that.
Sorry, Biz, you're cutting out. So could you repeat that, please?
Just one person who looks like wasn't able to use hand raise on the first question before I unmute another one of our speakers, just commented that as a project lead for DEI initiative in the organization, personally being interested in really moving the needle to improve the field in general.
Great.
So now for the next question, I'm going to unmute Jen Fry. Sorry, one second. Jen, can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
And I'm still seeing the question about why I'm personally interested in this. Is that the one I'm supposed to be answering?
You can answer either one.
Okay.
Yep.
So I work for an organization that works on voting rights and issues related to reforming the political process. And our organization's mission and vision is very much about creating a more accountable representative government and increasing the participation of underrepresented voters in the political process. I'm interested in this work and sort of seeing it increasing the impact of our organization, because we are a organization whose work is founded or rooted in the civil rights movement, but we're a white-led organization. And so there's this tension between the organization's leadership and the organization's constituency, and the extent to which we're really engaging diverse people and groups in the process of building political power to create a more representative government.
Great, thank you. So, Biz, for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to Nicola's section. But if other folks have thoughts on this question, go ahead and share your thoughts in the chat feature, and maybe we can circle back to them when we get to the Q&A at the end of the webinar. So thank you. Nicola, I am turning it over to you. Oh, you're on mute, Nicola.
Thanks, Janae. Hey, everybody, and I've got my webcam live, so hopefully you can see me. And a beautiful day here in Maine. And Biz, we can actually go ahead to the next slide. We wanted to ground everyone in a few definitions of what do we mean when we say diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we can put up all of the definitions at once, Biz. I know we've got some great animation. Thank you for that. And there's probably just one more thing that we're going to add at the bottom. So we wanted to share with folks what we mean when we say diversity, inclusion, and equity here. I'll give you a chance to read this slide. I think one of the key points that I just want to raise is, when we're talking about equity, it really does bring up a difference with equality. Equality being everyone having the same, and equity really accounting for differences, particularly historical differences, in how people have been treated that may be impacting the present. I know there's lots of other definitions and ways to define these terms. For the purposes of our time together, we wanted to throw these out there. So we can move to the next slide. So here you can see a difference that's a helpful picture about the difference between equality and equity, and some folks are maybe familiar with this. Our approach is that by taking into the full depth of equity, it really allows us to account for everyone to have what they need. We can go to the next slide. Great. So I wanted to ask folks anything you notice of interest about these definitions. Anything that you want to raise up about these definitions, and maybe Biz, we can go back to that slide while people are reflecting. Do these definitions reflect the words and approach that you use, or are there other aspects or approaches to these words that you've used in your work? And we can go ahead and either raise hands or put in the chat. And Biz, can you just go back one more slide for me? Any folks want to weigh in here?
While we're waiting for a hand raised, I see a question or a comment from maybe even a different portion of the presentation, but it seems relevant here. It says our grantees have very different capacity depending on their leadership's class background, interested in exploring capacity needs of grassroots organizations that are people of color and working class led. And so that seems relevant to this as well.
If you were breaking up a little bit, can you say that again?
Sorry. It's a comment that says our grantees have very different capacity depending on their leadership's class background, and the attendee is interested in exploring capacity needs that are different depending on the backgrounds of the grassroots organizations that are either people of color led or working class led. So perhaps that
yeah, and I think that's really, really important to take into account when approaching questions of diversity, inclusion, and equity. Particularly from a grant-making perspective. Those are often sometimes the questions that go unasked and unanswered in conversations. And in a few minutes, we're going to get to a deeper dive into how to have those conversations. So if there's no comments on the definitions, we can go forward to the next slide. And one more. So one reason that we want to ground in definitions, and I think just to keep this in mind as you're trying to have conversations in your organization, is sometimes we go to talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and if we haven't grounded in definitions, we're actually talking about different things. Or if we're only talking about diversity, we may just be talking about numerically how many people are we serving or how many people are represented, and we're not talking about are those people's voices actually being heard, which is what inclusion might lead us to bring, right? Or we may be in a room talking about, well, there aren't any poor people that have the skills that we need, or there aren't any people of color that have the skills that we need, when we're not asking ourselves what are the barriers to equity that may also be engaged. So we really like when we're approaching tough conversations and approaching identity to pause before having the conversation to ground in definition. We can move forward. So we wanted to open up some space to ask, like, how do you see diversity, equity, and inclusion playing out in your grant making? And how does what you see in your grant making translate into what's happening in your organization function?
If there are any folks who want to provide some feedback on this, I'm happy to take some raised hands. We have one in the comment section that says, in my organization, our conversations often end with diversity. We really don't talk about inclusion and equity both between our grantees' work or within our organization.
Does that resonate with others, and can folks speak to the impact of that?
Serving a diverse population. You can't have a city, not what's going on with organizations, delivering services and how representatives.
Do we have anyone else that wants to weigh in?
Looks like we have a hand raised here. I'm going to have Arati, if you're ready to share your perspective.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, speaking to the impact of that, actually we run a group called Women of Equity here that is women of color working in nonprofits, informally or formally taking on the roles around diversity, inclusion, and equity, and they have spoken a lot to kind of the impact of talking about diversity and then like recruiting people, bringing people into space, and then people feeling isolated, people feeling that they actually don't know how to make meaningful contributions, they're not given opportunities to do so, they feel alienated from just the social environment in different ways, and those kind of unwritten, unspoken rules of conduct are not explicitly described to folks. So all these different ways in which that diversity piece then backfires once people are in the room, can have a strong negative impact on organizationally, for sure.
Right, right. And you're really getting to a great point about why we wanted to do this webinar. Because a lot of times we dive in without having done the assessment or building the container to support successful conversations and successful engagement with each other. So with that comment, I'm going to turn it over to Althea, who's going to share a little bit more about how we connect to these tough conversations in philanthropy. And then after her, I will come back on and share with you some of our practical steps to how we think about approaching these tough conversations.
Thanks so much, Nicola. And Liz, if you can, great. So some of you may be familiar in real estate, the term is location, location, location. That's the most important thing in real estate. In philanthropy, it is definitely relationship, relationship, relationship. And I want to say a little bit more about the importance of that. If any of you have ever been on a date, you know that what you experience the very first day is not necessarily what happens over the course of knowing that person. You have to become a good listener in order to figure out how that relationship is going to move forward, and also to speak your truth in order to have a good, authentic relationship. And that certainly is true in philanthropy. Some of you may be familiar with Stephen Covey's work, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and one of the habits is seek first to understand, then to be understood. And so how could this apply in the world of philanthropy? Sometimes when we are folks who are different in some way than our philanthropic institutions that we go to work with, we can feel isolated or feel some of the, even potentially the microaggressions that may happen unintentionally as we walk into those spaces. And so it's important to have the opportunity to understand what that philanthropic institution's history has been with issues of diversity, inclusion, and equity, and to see how you work through that in the beginning. And we'll say more about having those conversations. So, Liz, I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. Is it possible to mute others? So some of the initiatives we have at our foundations are often about how we can do better by diverse people outside of our philanthropic institutions. Initiatives to do diabetes work in an African American community, or to get the vote out in Asian American communities, or to help those who are low income. It can be much easier to have that conversation about external folks than it can be to have that conversation internally, like how do these different identities that Janae showed us earlier, how do they play out within the workplace, and how are they being addressed equitably? So again, the important thing about understanding what the history has been, and then grounding a conversation, as Nicola said, in some terms that people can understand and start that conversation. So I want to share with you on the next slide a couple of examples of what happened for us with Hispanics in philanthropy. I think we missed a slide somewhere. Can you back up a second? There we go. Hispanics in philanthropy in North Carolina. So one brief background about HIP's philosophy is that HIP, the acronym for Hispanics in Philanthropy, are focused on supporting Latino-led, Latino-serving organizations, because the philosophy is that we want to strengthen Latino communities and have those who are deciding what's going to happen with Latino communities to be Latino themselves, so empowering the community to be able to serve and strengthen their own community. The disconnect for us was that we were funding those kinds of groups, but then we looked at the decision-making process internally here in North Carolina. We noticed that a majority of the funders at the table in this collaborative, the majority were not Latino. We noticed that when we were designing programs or figuring out new initiatives for our grant making, we didn't have Latinos at the table. And when we were making decisions about who we were going to allocate funds to, we didn't have Latinos at the table. And so we had some really great conversations that took probably about a year and a half to have those conversations about how, if our philosophy is about supporting communities by supporting leaders within that community, how could we ourselves be more reflective of that? So we took 2 steps. One was in designing our programs, training programs that we were going to do with grantees. Instead of just doing for the grantees, funders deciding for the grantees, and non-Latino funders deciding for grantees, we decided to invite several grantees to be part of this subcommittee that was going to design the training program. And so we wanted to make sure that we had geographic representation from across the state, so thinking about rural and urban communities, as well as having more Latino voices at the table. And we wanted to make sure that the power dynamic was pretty balanced. One of the folks on the call just said about how when one person gets added to a group to make it more diverse, how unempowering that can be. So we had 4 funders at the table for this subcommittee, and we added 3 grantees to the table. So there were a small subcommittee of 7 people, but pretty well balanced funder to grantee and non-Latino to Latino. So we ended up having quite a bit of juicy conversation from that. Also to say that we recognize that a lot of times in philanthropy we say, oh, we want grantees to participate in this decision-making process, but we don't make it financially feasible for them to do that. So we wanted to make sure we were compensating them for coming to the Capitol in North Carolina, to Raleigh, or wherever it was that we were having meetings, reimbursing them for expenses and making it feasible for these grantees who don't have always the same access as funders do to that level of participation. So that power dynamic we also addressed. And the second place that we did that is in expanding the input on grant decisions. So again, we had, I think out of 11 funders, we had 1 Latina funder, and so we wanted to balance that. So what we ended up doing was asking folks from several organizations across the state who may not even have been in philanthropy, but who were community leaders who knew their communities and were Latino to come be part of the committee that made grant decisions. So they went out and did site visits as well and were part of the decision making when we came to that point. I have to say it totally changed the conversations that we had around grant making. Their input, their perspective taught us quite a bit, taught the funders quite a bit. And so it took a while to vet those people and to make those changes internally, but it made for a much richer and more equitable conversation when we make grant decisions. I'll turn it back over to, I think, Nicola next.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. I really love those real-world examples, and I find those so useful. Thank you, Althea. So, yeah, we can actually, Biz, you were on the right slide. You can move forward again. Yep, please. Thank you. That's great. So now we want to talk about some practical steps. So we started by opening up the conversation around why would we want to approach diversity, equity, and inclusion in our organization? Why would we want to bring our identity more into work, or other people's identity more into work? And what's at stake at the work? Grounding in that, and we now want to talk about, so what are the steps that we would take? And we're going to throw out 4 steps for you to chew on. I think everyone has to tailor their own journey to their context and where they're at in their learning. But here are some best practices from several years of trying to do this with other organizations. The first is, often when we're approaching questions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we can feel a sense of urgency, because there is a real urgency. As was mentioned by several commenters, there are real impacts in communities, A, when we're not talking about these things, and B, when we're not talking about them well, right? Before we go in, though, it is very helpful to clarify what our intentions are and be clear about what's personally at stake for each of us and what's at stake for the organization. Because sometimes we take a bigger bite at the apple, a bigger bite of the conversation and say, we need to fix all of these things right now. Or, you know, I really want to talk about this identity, but ignore this identity. And we can get lost and confused in the conversation. So taking a minute, taking some time to self-reflect and say, How am I entering this conversation? Where is my generosity of spirit with others? And what might they be bringing in their intentions to the conversation can really help us start with a successful groundwork. The next piece that we like to really encourage people to start at is clarifying expectations. So again, a lot of times these issues can feel quite overwhelming because they are. And it can feel like we have to solve everything, or we have to take on the biggest, most urgent problem. I often like to say that approaching diversity, equity, and inclusion work is a lot like preparing to run a marathon. And you have to take baby steps, and you have to have smaller growth points. Being able to run a mile or being able to run half a mile before you do your 20 miles or your 21 miles, it's really important. And so as we're starting these conversations, it can be very critical to say, okay, what is a reasonable expectation given the context of this organization, given our history where we're at, and given my own development of what could happen in the next 6 months? And talking to people like Janae or Althea or myself that are in your life that have done some of this work before can often help calibrate those expectations within your organization. Can you go to the next slide, please? And as we continue to go deeper into our exploration of diversity, equity, and inclusion within organizations, as we grounded in our own intentions, as we set some expectations, another step that we often miss in having these conversations is asking questions of your team. So before you go in and you say, okay, I want to see us increase the number of people of color grantees that we have. Let's do that right now. A question that happens is, well, what has the relationship of your organization been to that question in the past? How has your organization handled these issues? Is this something they've already been thinking about? Is this something that they tried to work on 2 years ago and then never got a chance to? It's really important to understand your context fully and spend time getting to understand the intentions of others around you before going in and saying, okay, everything needs to be changed right now. One thing I like to really ground people in is we're used to being successful at execution. Execution is king, impact is king. And so we approach that with that same goal in mind for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what we miss is the preparation that allows us to make smart decisions of really understanding our context. So I'm seeing a couple of questions come in on the chat around, Nico, can you give particular examples about each of those steps? And actually, Althea is going to come right back on after me. I'm just doing the high-level overview, and Althea will share concrete examples with you. So as you've had a chance to ground in your intention, calibrate your expectations, and learn more about your context, then you really get to the place where you can make the ask. And you can really get to say, can we do some exploratory conversations? Can we bring in outside facilitators to begin to raise awareness? What is the right next step? If we've been burned in the past, could we do some reflection on lessons learned? If this feels scary, like what might it be to build a safe container? Like what are some of those initial first steps that we can ask for that allow everyone to grow with us? You know, shifting the status quo is very different than executing a strategic plan. And so we have to really understand that the work doesn't start, you know, once we're starting to, you know, interview diverse new candidates for our grant program. The work really starts internally when we start asking the right questions, being curious, educating ourselves, and preparing ourselves to then do that work. So I'm going to turn it over to Althea to give us some concrete examples.
Thanks so much, Nicola. So Nicola set this up beautifully about the patience that is needed, as you see this quote there about patience. It really does take baby steps to make some of these changes internally, which can be a little frustrating if we're at one level of understanding about equity issues in our institution is not there. So patience is really needed, and a willingness to learn, both as staff as well as the organization, a desire to really make changes. And so those beginning conversations that Nicola was referencing are really important. It's also important to recognize this learning about identity is an ongoing process for everyone, no matter how diverse we are from the mainstream identity. All of us, when we know better, we do better, and that knowing better takes time. When we have those conversations internally, it's important to think about having those conversations at staff and board levels. We know there are certainly times in our philanthropic institutions where staff is way ahead of the curve of knowing about equity issues, and board has not had that access to information. So making sure how do we move both board and staff along together is really important. Next slide, please. So folks asked about having some tangible examples. Here are both some small examples and some larger examples. At an organization that I was in, we wanted to try and be more equitable in everyone having leadership of staff meetings. It may seem like a small thing, but before we had this conversation, it was always senior staff who was leading, facilitating the meeting, and talking throughout most of the meeting. And junior staff were absorbing, or hopefully absorbing, everything that was going on. Perhaps some of you have had that experience as well in organizations. So we said, well, we want to make it more equitable, distribute this. And so we're just going to make these random assignments. And all of a sudden, junior staff were being asked to take leadership and to facilitate the meetings or to pull the meetings together. And that was one step towards equity, but as that wonderful little graphic that Nicola showed, that really was more a step towards equality and not equity, because we weren't giving them the tools to be successful in that role. And so after realizing that, after a few tries, we talked about how can we provide professional development for them around meeting facilitation and public speaking so that they can feel comfortable and competent to do that. How do we provide some mentorship for that? And so this may seem like a small example, but this goes across all kinds of diversity issues where we sometimes put the one person who is Latino or Asian or one of our LGBT community on the spot and say, okay, now you do this, without realizing we need to help build their competency and confidence as well. And the second piece that I want to highlight is about the board awareness. I was at a foundation once making a presentation about HIP's work, and several folks on the board were really interested in figuring out how they could have more Latinos joining that community foundation as donors. In North Carolina, the average age of Latinos is 24, a very young population as opposed to others around the country. And that board really didn't understand that. When I told them about that, they said, yeah, so how do we get them on board? And so I had to say, can you remember what you were doing when you were 24? Were you thinking about donating your millions? Or were you raising a family and building your equity, you know, your assets and so forth? And that was like an aha moment for them. And I said, you might want to think about how do you help support the growth of that community now, so that then when they are at the stage in their life, like you are, that they have the assets to be able to contribute, they'll have a relationship to the community foundation in a way that can be mutually beneficial. So it's oftentimes our board who are left out of those cultural competence conversations, and we really need to bring them along too, not just bring our staff along, and make having equity conversations part of regular board meetings. The same as when we're selecting board members, whoever that one person was who talked about the one person that joined, then for them to realize that we can't just add one of each category and feel like we've accomplished anything. We don't want to make them the token spokesperson for whatever that category is. We need to have a comprehensive strategy where we have several people who represent multiple identities there and change the culture talking about equity and inclusion at the board level. I think I turn it over to Janae now. Is that true?
Yep, it is. Great. So thank you both, Althea and Nicola, for sharing. And this is the point that everyone loves, where we can take some questions and answers. So both Althea and Nicola and myself, if you have questions for me, are available to answer those. You can use the chat feature, or you can raise your hand and Biz will plug you in. While we're waiting for that, I just want to acknowledge some folks who did comment earlier when we raised a question around how the definitions resonate with them. And several people mentioned the definition of diversity in particular, and how organizations tend to default at diversity, or someone said stop at diversity, which can actually have a negative impact and detract from the ideas of equity and inclusion, because organizations will think that they've hit the mark, or they've addressed these concerns by talking about differences and increasing difference, but not really dealing with equity and inclusion. So I'll pause there. Biz, do we have any questions?
No, we're still waiting. Would love to see if you guys have more to share. I know there's been a lot of excitement about the examples and about the kind of high-level thinking. So if folks have lingering questions, or even just shout-outs for something they heard that they really, really appreciated, would love to pass that along through the question box, or I can unmute you if you raise your hand.
While we're waiting,
yes, we were both, Nicola and I, while we're waiting, wanted to say that a couple of years ago in North Carolina, the network of grant makers did a webinar specifically about how to create more equity and inclusion within the walls of philanthropy. And so for those of you who are part of regional grant maker associations, I highly recommend that you bring this topic to your grant maker association to have it on their radar as well. And there's a lot of buzz now about the millennials and how do we engage more millennials? I'd say those of you who are in that category, bring that to the forefront about equity issues for young people in philanthropy, and how you all want to have that discussion as well with other grant makers. Nicola?
Yeah. And the three of us would love to come to your regional association and do a workshop about it. So we do have a question here. So how do we have a conversation without falling into the trap that you're attacking someone else's space while asking for your seat at the table? So Nicola, I see you nodding. Do you have thoughts about this?
that is a really tough one. Here's a couple of simple things that I would say. Is I think one of the key pieces, especially coming from a junior staff position, is if we've rushed into the conversation before building trust and safety with each other, this is often what happens. Or other things like that, right? Whatever it is. And this really gets back to what I was going to share earlier, which is that one of the hardest parts of these conversations is clarifying intentions and being able to communicate those. Particularly if you yourself are a woman or a person of color or LGBTQ or come from a low-income background, like if you have had personal experiences of these issues and these systemic oppression, and then are trying to be an advocate for yourself within the organization, there can be a lot going on. And so I like to say, when those triggers come up, they are both a reflection of the individual sitting in front of you and the systemic systems of oppression that we're all entrapped in. And so I often try to walk back to a space of saying, okay, let's walk back to building relationship, building safety, building understanding, and understanding of each other before diving in. Because when we get to attack, it's clearly there's a breach of safety, a breach of trust, and it can be really hard when you bear the brunt of that, right? We often say in diversity, equity, and inclusion learning, it's those that have experienced oppression directly that sometimes have to learn that those of privilege learn at the expense of. And that can be a really hard thing to hold. So I'm not saying that that's the ideal. I'm not saying that's the ideal. But engaging in the attack, trying to rectify the attack, is usually impossible at that stage of the game. And so stepping back, allowing time for cooling off of the system, and then re-engaging in relationship is often the only way forward for us. Althea and Janae, would you add something different or have a totally different approach?
Well, actually, we have a couple other questions coming in, and we're getting short on time, so I want to make sure we get to these questions.
Okay, sorry.
And also, your answer was excellent, so of course, we have nothing to add. So I'm going to ask both questions, and each of you can take them as you will, and then we'll wrap up. So the first is an appreciation for the emphasis on relationship building and baby steps, but the person is also curious if there are any examples or tips on creating opportunities for leaps in addition to the baby steps, or taking advantage of that open space. And then the last question is, what do you do in organizations that think that they are on the cutting edge of diversity, but from that person's perspective, they may not be? So how do you initiate conversations there?
I'd like to take that first one about how you ripen opportunities.
Yep.
Back to the relationship piece. If you don't have the relationship to ripen that opportunity, find who does. And in the philanthropic world, I have found it so helpful to engage peer learning, where I find foundations who are doing what I would hope the foundation I'm working with is going to do. And so to engage that peer learning and relationship building. So there have been many times that I have had meetings, lunches, breakfasts, whatever, where I bring other peers to talk to folks in my foundation, and I'm not the one saying anything. I'm having them be the voice of what's possible, and that can catalyze the growth in the foundation, both to take action and to take action when they don't feel that they're totally on their own taking action. They're part of a community that is doing different practices, and they can join that. So we have certainly some foundations who are leaders in some of this work, and some who are followers, and recognizing what kind of foundation you're in and finding what would be helpful for them. So for those leaders, sometimes it's just putting them in front of information that they say, yep, we're headed there. Some who are followers and more responsive, they need to be within a group, a sort of community of others who are doing that, and follow along and learn that way.
Yeah. And then on the, how do you lift up a mirror to an organization that may not be on the cutting edge but think that they are? Two things that come to mind for me really quickly. One is seeking out other models and offering them from a place of generosity. So seeking out models of places that are doing the activities that you'd like to see at your organization, and sharing those from a sense of opportunity, not, oh, we're so behind, look, I'm proving you wrong, but like, wow, I get that this organization is trying to be on the cutting edge of diversity. Look at this interesting model that's here. What could be improved in our impact? And really asking that question, what could be improved in our impact? And always bringing it back to the impact and help people see that there's a step further. I think the second piece is having this conversation about outcomes. So wow, we're seeing these outcomes. Could we get more? Are we at the height of our outcomes? That can be like an interesting thing, like, wow, we've diversified the vendors that we use. Is that really the edge of where we could go? What could be next are useful questions to use. And then I saw a follow-up question asking, what did I mean by stepping back from attack? What does that mean? I'll just speak really, really briefly to that. Is diversity, as I said earlier, diversity, equity, and inclusion work is different than executing a strategic plan or building a budget or building a curriculum or a program. It's a deeply, deeply intimate engagement that often brings out our personal stuff that can lead to attacking each other or attacking ourselves. And that's when those ouch moments and those pinches happen, or microaggressions. And so that's what I'm referring to, is stepping back from those moments, and rather than leaning in and saying, I'm going to fight you on this, I'm going to accept the premise of the question, and I'm going to, really go with, sometimes all that leads to is gridlock. It's gridlock and more hurt. And so the invitation is to step back, regroup, re-identify, realign, and then engage in what are we really trying to talk about here? What are we really trying to build together?
Thank you.
And that's not to say that the attack is okay.
Right.
But just to say that biting the hook doesn't get you where.
Right.
Okay, I'll turn it over to Janae.
Thank you. And that was a great response. And just to add to that as well, you know, if you do feel attacked or if you feel isolated, there are lots of communities, even within philanthropy, and I think EPIP is one of them, that are creating spaces to talk about these things openly and support one another. So we're going to move on to our last slide. We are here at the end of our presentation, and we wanted to leave you with a few resources. The book Dialogue by William Isaacs. There are several websites linked here that are self-explanatory. And we certainly hope, all three of us, Althea, Nicola, and I, hope that you will visit our organization's websites, which are listed at the bottom. We have a ton of resources, and we would love to follow up with each of you if you have additional questions. Please, I don't think that we put our social media handles on here. That was an oversight, but you can find all of us online, on Facebook, on Twitter, so please give us a shout out, and of course, give a shout out to EPIP as well. So thank you so much for your time and your participation, and I will turn it over to Biz for any closing comments.
Thank you so much. This has been a really wonderful conversation and so much rich information and awesome examples. So I know this is the beginning of a larger conversation, and we really appreciate you guys taking the time to kick it off so amazingly. So thank you all. Thank you to all our attendees. Thank you for participating in all the different ways that you did. You can also feel free to tag us from EPIP National on Twitter if you have any feedback or shout-outs, and definitely if you have questions or want to follow up on specifics, biz@epip.org, and I will help you connect with folks. Keep an eye out for the survey, keep an eye out for the recording, and we look forward to having another conversation with you guys in a few weeks. So thanks so much. Take care.
I can still see you, Althea. Thank you.
Thank you.